to send me to a Christian school. So 6 days a week, I was in a structured Bible class where I was studying the Word academically. I knew a lot about the Word growing up. I knew right from wrong. I knew a lot of great answers and all kinds of stuff. And growing up, there was a life verse that was spoken over me. It was in that era. So my mom, my grandmother, a lot of other godly people in my life said, Aaron, there's a verse that is special for you. This verse has a special significance on your life because God has got wonderful plans for you. If you've been in church a long time, it's one of the most famous verses in the Bible, Jeremiah 29:11. If you know it, say it with me. It's going to be on the screen for you. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. What a wonderful word. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Now, I grew up hearing things with that verse spoken over me. Aaron, God's going to do amazing things through you. God's going to do wonderful things. He's got wonderful things for you. And there's a long story about how I came to be, and it's an amazing story involving my adoption and my history and how my family came to be what it was and how I even got to be here in Cape Coral. I don't have time to tell you all the details, but it's really awesome. So I was special to my parents, like real special. So they told me this. Growing up, I studied the Word and went to a Bible college, and Jeremiah actually became one of my favorite prophets. One of the reasons was that I saw some parallels between his life and my own. If you study it, we were both called to ministry at an early age. I got radically saved when I was 15. That was when this went from the religion I was raised with to a faith that I chose. And that same time was when I also felt God call me into ministry. And for the longest time, I was convinced that that meant vocational ministry. I would work at a church, I would be a pastor, I'd be a lead pastor, I'd be a preacher, a youth pastor, something. And I spent a lot of time pursuing what that would look like. Jeremiah did the same thing. He was from a relatively small town, not much smaller than Cape Coral. And he was called to ministry at 19. And God said, the words I say, you're going to say, and it's going to suck. Yeah, that's the message Jeremiah was told at 19. He proceeded to spend the next 45 years of his life chasing after that ministry, obeying God, doing everything God asked him, and I mean everything. But he always had this feeling of futility, this idea that even if I obey, the things I'm trying to stop may still come to pass. So a little bit of background about Jeremiah. See, I told you I'm going to need those notes. A little bit of background about Jeremiah. He lived in a time called the divided kingdom. For those who don't know, Solomon's descendants, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, and other leaders split the kingdom at Solomon's death. There was a huge civil war. The northern 10 tribes became the nation of Israel, and the southern 2.5 tribes around Jerusalem became the kingdom of Judah. And it didn't take very long for the northern kingdom of Israel to start to incorporate the religions of the areas around. They started to stray from God. God raised up prophets to tell them, hey, this isn't right. This isn't what our covenant was. This isn't going to work. I can't protect you from what's coming if we're not going to live the way I teach you. And eventually, the Assyrian Empire came in, marched across the country, killed thousands of people, and dragged even more into exiles and wiped the northern kingdom off the map. The prophet Isaiah was in the southern kingdom at the time. He saw all that happen. And a generation later, as the southern kingdom of Judah was starting to drift away as well, that was when God raised up Jeremiah. He spent his entire ministry preaching in the streets and in the temple courts and in the king's courts. The same message over and over and over from God. And that message was very much like a father pleading with his children. I love you. Come back to me. Remember our covenant. The deal was, you be my people, I'll be your God. I'll give you all the provision, protection, all the blessings, everything that comes with that. And all you got to do is love me, worship me, and live the way I teach you because that's what's best for you anyway. That's what a covenant is. And as further Israel strayed from that, God said, I can't protect you from what's coming. And Jeremiah knew what was coming. And what was coming was Babylon. At the end of Jeremiah's ministry, after 45 years, Nebuchadnezzar, name we've recognized from the Bible, and the empire of Babylon came, laid siege to Jerusalem for an entire year. Conditions inside that walled city deteriorated so bad. Jeremiah saw people trying to eat other people's babies. He saw them animals become a delicacy if you could catch them. It got really, really bad. After a year, Babylon stormed the gates, marched in, killed most of the people that they could find, carried a few more off into exile, destroyed the first temple that Solomon had built, and then proceeded to burn the city to the ground, wiped out the kingdom. And Jeremiah and a handful of people managed to escape, make their way to the Jordan River a few miles away, sit down on the banks of the Jordan where they could see the smoke and they could see the flames and weep. That was all they had. I can't imagine a more clear, complete picture of failure, to work your life off for 45 years to try and prevent something from happening and then live just long enough to see it happen. That's the history of Jeremiah, when he saw Jerusalem burning. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. I'm a storyteller by nature. I could do this until next Tuesday. The short version is, having grown up in church, having grown up in a Bible-believing family, having gone to church for so long, going to a Christian school, around the time that I was 10 or 13, somewhere in that ballpark, things that happen to most boys that age happened to me. And I started to discover some things and lean into some things. And the short version is, I developed an addiction. The kind of addiction that is easy to keep secret. I became addicted to, essentially, lust and fantasy. Now, the things that went with that, there were physical actions that went with that. And yes, porn was the easiest tool for that addiction. I know people can get addicted to porn itself. That wasn't actually the case for me, because I discovered I could fill my addiction without porn, truthfully. It was the escape. It was the good feeling chemicals that came from the release of engaging in fantasy, disconnecting from reality, and engaging in lust in every way I could. I knew it was sinful. I knew it was wrong. But I reached a place pretty quick where I was using that to medicate a lot of childhood trauma that I never knew how to deal with, until it became a compulsion. I didn't know how to stop. And that sounds crazy to some of you, unless you're going through an addiction where you don't know how to stop. You don't have your own answers. Because it was such a shameful thing, I managed to keep it secret from everybody. I kept it secret from my family, from my church friends. I kept it a secret from the people at the Bible college I went to. I kept it a secret from my girlfriend, who then became my wife, and it stayed a secret until 4 years into our marriage. Until February 11th, 2011. By that point, I had started to have some relationships, some godly people in my life speaking into me saying, hey, Aaron, you know this is a lot worse than you think it is. Like, you know you're in more trouble than you think. You need more help than you're willing to go get. That was what it came to. And I wasn't prepared to actually do all the things I needed to do to start making progress to get out, because I was scared to death that if I did, I'd have to tell my wife. And if I told my wife, she'd leave me. And let's be real, guys. I was a young 20-something at the time. That was everything to me. My single greatest fear was that if people knew the truth about who I was and what I did in secret, I would lose everything. My wife would leave me, for one thing. I'd never get to be a pastor and get into ministry, because who wants to hire a divorced pastor? That's the way I thought at the time. I know a lot better now. Who'd want to hire a pastor who struggles with this? Would they ever really be able to trust him? And I genuinely became scared that not only would I not have a family or a ministry, but I would basically be spending the rest of my life just trying to pick up the pieces and make the best of it. So February 11th, 2011, I lost my job. I got fired over something stupid. And I went home and I did what I've always done to medicate, to shut down negative feelings and get those feel-good chemicals in my brain. And then I showered and shaved and put together my resume and drove to the Edison Mall to start handing out my resume and shaking managers' hands, because I actually thought that was how it still worked at the time. And then my wife came home and I said, babe, I got bad news. I lost my job today. And she goes, that's not good. She didn't like that much. I said, but it's okay. I'm working on it. Then she picked up my phone, and I realized I had not covered my tracks properly. And she saw exactly what I had been looking at. Over the years, she had seen little behaviors here and there, little incidents, but she had no idea of the depth or breadth of my problem. I had kept it that secret. But thankfully, there were enough people, godly people, pouring into my life. I had reached a place where I really hit my rock bottom. I knew in that moment that if I lied to her, she'd leave and all my worst fears would come true. But if I told her the truth, and I mean the truth, if I stopped hiding and pretending, there was a chance she'd probably still leave. But there was a chance that at least in the process of picking up those pieces, I'd find some kind of freedom. I really hit my breaking point that night. That turned into 3 hours of yelling and crying and really hard questions and me giving almost emotionless, blunt, straightforward, unfiltered answers. Right around midnight, she packed a bag. She threw some clothes in a bag and drove to her sister's. And having nowhere to be the next morning and not wanting to do what I'd been doing that caused all these problems and not having to be around anybody because she wasn't there, I made myself a glass of Pepsi and sat on the couch and started flipping channels without even looking at the TV because my Jerusalem was burning. I was done. I had nothing. I had no idea what the next day was going to be like. 35 minutes later, she walked back in the door, took one look at me, walked into our bedroom and closed the door. That turned into another 3 weeks or so of random, unprompted, hard questions. Hey, what about this? And I had to give her complete and unfiltered answers. That 3 weeks turned into 4 or 5 months of real touch and go. I don't know what happens next. I don't know where we go from here. I just know I've got to keep being honest and start getting help. That was when I started going to meetings. Yeah, I went to SA meetings. There's nothing more humbling than going to an SA meeting where you sit in a circle. And say, hi guys, my name is Aaron, I'm a sex addict. There it is. There's some in every crowd. Why would that be? I got into counseling as well. I got into really good, thank God, by the grace of God, I got a really good Christian counselor. He was both a pastor and a counselor, and he was amazing. He counseled me, he counseled my wife, he counseled us together. Those 4 months turned into more hard work, and that turned into about 4 years before we really felt stable again. One of my favorite things about my counselor, really good counselors know the right moment and the right force with which to punch you in the gut. So I remember talking to him, and at one point he had said to me, man, Aaron, it's amazing how well you defend your narcissism. And that stopped me mid-sentence, right? But one of my favorite stories, one of my favorite things that he actually did was he says to me one day, look, Aaron, I hear everything you're dealing with and all your thought process, and I hear all of this, and I see your cycle. Look, I want you to memorize Romans 6, 7, and 8. And my first response, being the arrogant little cuss I was like, sure, a couple of verses. I did this growing up all the time. Romans 6, 7, and 8. You want them next week, right? Yeah, sure. No, Aaron. I want you to memorize Romans 6, Romans 7, and Romans 8. I want you to be able to write them out in their entirety, correctly, on cue. It doesn't have to be next week, but that's your assignment. You're done when you can do that. I'd like to tell you I did. Never got all the way through being able to memorize and write down all of them. But there did come a point when he says, it's okay, you've got it. And that was when I realized the point of the assignment wasn't for me to memorize 3 chapters. It was that in trying to do so, I would be reading those chapters, those verses, day after day after day. I would be hearing those verses all the time, constantly, hammering the nail a little further, until it drove all the way into my heart. And those verses changed my life. So, Pastor Brian has graciously taken the risk of putting me up here. If I don't ever get back up here, I just want to tell you guys about 3 things I learned from Romans 7 and 8. 6 is a lot of setup for 7 and 8. But one of the ones that really jumped out at me that I had to deal with, because I was stuck in a cycle, was that shame is a liar. Shame is a liar. Someone much smarter than me, I recently learned the quote that shame is the emotion that tells us that we don't deserve relationship. If you look at Romans 7, Paul has been talking about the dichotomy between following the law and living by the law, and yet that is what condemns us to sin versus living in grace. In Romans 7:14, he starts to say, the trouble is with me. This is Paul, wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, planted churches all over the world. The trouble is with me, for I am all too human, a slave to sin. I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. But if I know that what I'm doing is wrong, this shows that I agree that the law is good. So I'm not the one doing wrong, it's sin living in me that does it. And I know that nothing good lives in me, in my sinful nature. I want to do what is right, but I don't but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. But if I do what I don't want to do, I'm not really the one doing it wrong. It is sin in me that does it. Paul is literally saying the devil made me do it. This, guys, was the cycle of my addiction. It started, oh, is that where the page break is? This was the cycle of my addiction. It started out medicating and whatever it started until it became a compulsion, doing something sinful over and over and not knowing how to stop. Because I couldn't stop and because I knew it was wrong and I didn't know why I'm like this, that instantly turned into a great deal of shame. There it is. A great deal of shame. So much so that I knew, why am I like this? Joe, you hear me say all the time, why are you like this? This is what I said to myself. Why are you like this? You know better, and you can't stop. Why? It was shame. Hardcore shame and self-loathing. Well, naturally, I didn't want anybody else in my life to know about this, so I isolated. I didn't want my wife to know about it. I didn't want the people at church to know about it. I didn't want my friends to know about it. I didn't want my family to know about it. This is not a conversation I could have with my dad. I love my dad, but this was not a conversation I could go to him with. So naturally, I isolated myself, and one of the things you learn in recovery is that if we already had the answers, this wouldn't be a problem. The reason they get together in community is to find a solution to our common problem. Well, I had cut myself off from all forms of help because I was living in the dark. I kept it in the dark. I isolated myself completely. Well, naturally, without any answers and without any help, what happened? I turned right back into my own compulsions, into my sinful nature. And because I couldn't break my own cycle, I became shameful and continued to isolate. And it continued, and it continued, and it continued. But in my core, deep down in my heart, this is the one thing that saved me. I knew that this wasn't who I wanted to be. Paul talks in the next few verses about a war in himself. And let me tell you guys, the next few verses became one of my new life verses. Quick note about the Bible, we added the chapter divisions in later. When Paul was writing, this is basically a holy stream of consciousness. You can't understand the beginning of 8 without the end of 7. You can't get the end of 7 without understanding this leading into the beginning of 8. I want you guys to read those verses with me because Paul literally took these words out of my mind and wrote them on paper 2,000 years ago. Romans 7:24. Oh, what a miserable person I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? Thank God the answer is in Christ Jesus our Lord. You see how it is. In my mind, I really want to obey God's law, but because of my sinful nature, I am a slave to sin. Right into chapter 8, my new life verse. Now, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Our shame wants to tell us that we are unforgivable, that we are stuck, that we're unfixable, and that our problem is our defining characteristic. God says we are not defined by our failures, but rather by setting our mind on Him and on what only He can do. Guys, shame is a liar, so what do you do to shame? Shame is a liar, so what do you do to a liar? You speak the truth back. Shame says you're unlovable. You say, no, I am forgiven. No, I have value. No, I matter. No, I can be saved and am saved. And most importantly, I am loved. And that leads me right into the next thing I learned. Nothing will ever make you unlovable to Him. This one is simple. It's not complicated. I don't have a bunch of fancy notes or an outline to prove it. It's just hard because shame, the liar, wants to tell you. It uses our own voice to tell us that our failures make us unlovable. I was projecting my own loathing and self-hatred onto God. How could He love me? I haven't really repented of a darn thing. I keep doing the same thing over and over, right? That's the lie from the enemy. This part isn't in the slides, but on your notes. The rest of chapter 8, Paul talks about that our identity comes from where we set our mind. This is why I said a bit ago, what saved me? What actually let me start taking a step out was my mind, was where I set my mind, what I chose to focus on. He says that setting it on our mind on the flesh, the sinful nature and the things of this world keeps us a slave to sin leading to death. Emotional, relational, spiritual, even physical. But setting our mind on the Spirit gives us life. It gives us victory over death, hope, and adoption as sons. A huge part of the pain I was medicating came from the unanswered questions I had about my own adoption. I was adopted. That story I mentioned that I'm like, I don't have enough time to tell you all of this story. I got like 10 minutes right now. I was adopted and I grew up with huge questions, huge holes in my heart and my mind about my identity, who I was, where I came from. There's a big dichotomy because I had a loving, caring family, but I also had unanswered questions. And I had no way to reconcile the two. And all of that fear and pain became a huge part of what I medicated. But once I started to understand what it is to be adopted as sons only through Jesus' love by God, that was when the game started to change for me. That changed a whole new level when I started to become a father myself. Jesus' sacrifice, and more importantly than just his sacrifice, his resurrection victory over death. Because the cross means nothing without the empty tomb. That is what lets us set our minds on the Spirit and live in his love despite our own failures and sin. Guys, this was so hard for me to get. Romans 8:35, towards the end of the chapter, he talks about, what shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? He's talking about the things that we may have to suffer because we follow Christ. No, in all of these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Not chose us, not saved us, not raised us up, through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor demons, nor the present, nor the future, nor any powers, neither height, nor depth, nor your anger issues, nor your parenting failures, nor your failures as a son, nor how you've treated your spouse, nor the corners you've cut in your business, the things you're afraid of, nor your drinking or your drug habit, your lustful, sinful nature in my heart, or the lies that I've told, or the times I've manipulated things, or the times I failed to do what Christ asked me to do, nor anything else in all of creation can separate me from the love of Christ. Guys, it's almost hokey. I debated even doing this, but the most clear illustration I ever got out of this was that your sin wants you to feel unloved, and Jesus literally said, I love you this much. When I started to understand this, I was able to start accepting his forgiveness for myself. I started to forgive myself, and this was where that cycle of shame started to break. I had a way out. Interestingly enough, I also no longer required her forgiveness for my own well-being. There was a bit of codependency where I needed my wife to be okay with me because I wasn't okay with myself. But once I came to understand his abiding, unconditional love and internalize that, and that became a part of me, I realized that I didn't need that from her. She was free to do whatever she felt she needed to do. Stay, go, get help, don't. That was not. Don't get me wrong. I fought hard for my marriage. We fought hard for our marriage, and we have been for a long time. But I knew I reached a level of peace, that peace Pastor Brian talked about, knowing that even if my worst fears happened, even if she left and I did lose everything, I would still be all right because God loved me more than I could ever love myself. That was hard. One last thing that I need you guys to know. I hope that my words so far have been giving hope to people who are stuck, to the guys who are struggling, because I know what it's like to be stuck and struggling. Some of us have been through this and we're kind of on the other side of it. I want to give you this last thing. God's best work in you will be part of his best work through you. Let me say that again. God's best work in you will be part of his work through you. Just a few verses before in Romans 8:28, he says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. There is a reason for it. To really kind of illustrate that, we got to go back to Jeremiah. Jeremiah 29:11. I do believe that in order to understand a verse, you kind of got to understand the chapter, the historical and the Bible context around it. Jeremiah 29:11 is part of Jeremiah 29, which is a letter. If we rewind the clock 3 years from prior to Jerusalem burning, was the first time that Babylon came to Jerusalem. You see, they had run into a bit of trouble. They had had a massive battle with Egypt, a battle of Carchemish, and they won. And then they ran into a wall when they tried to invade Egypt. And so they turned around with their tail between their legs, and most of the world said, oh, maybe Babylon's not as strong as we thought. And so when word of that got to Jerusalem, the king of Judah said, well, maybe we don't have to pay the tribute anymore. Yeah, I don't think we're going to pay the tribute to Babylon anymore. And Nebuchadnezzar got word of that and said, oh, really? So they marched right up to the walls, laid siege, and this one was really short. The king caved after only 3 months. Babylon walks in, and they basically decide, we don't want to destroy you completely. We like having your territory. We like having your tribute. But we do want to make sure you don't ever get the chance to try this again. So they did the only thing that really made any sense. They basically kidnapped thousands of people. They took the best and the brightest from inside Judah and Jerusalem. These were young men. These were craftsmen. These were religious leaders. These were spiritual leaders. These were all of the best and brightest that they could find, and hauled them off to Babylon so that they could work for Babylon's benefit and leave Judah with whatever is left. There were among those people, by the way, this is the context where we see stories like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the 3 guys in the furnace, and the 4th one, we saw Jesus in there with them. That's where that happens. In Babylon, this is that crowd. But there are also among those people false prophets saying, hey, don't panic. I got to do my false prophet voice. Don't panic. God will rescue us. God will provide. God will bring us home soon. Don't even unpack. We won't be here long. Jeremiah had been left in Jerusalem with the new puppet king that Nebuchadnezzar had installed, and God taps him on the shoulder and says, hey, I need you to write a letter. I need you to write a letter to the exiles. At this point, if I'm Jeremiah, after 40-some-odd years of preaching against everything happening, knowing full well that we just narrowly averted disaster, and it's probably still going to happen anyway soon, Jeremiah knew this was coming. You really want to write a letter telling these guys how to live now that they're not even here in this country anymore? But he does. And God says to Jeremiah, I need you to write a letter. Here's what I want you to put in the letter. To the exiles, settle in, buy property, plant gardens, marry your sons and daughters, pray for the welfare of the city you're in, because that's going to be your welfare as well. That's hard. That's a tough pill to swallow. God was telling them, your grandchildren are going to be born here and you will probably die here. I'm not coming for you soon, because I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. The verse was never meant for just Jeremiah. It was never meant for just us, the way it was told to me and spoken over me as a child. It's true. He does have great plans for us. But it's not just for us. There's a purpose behind all of it. It was a message that Jeremiah in his failure was supposed to send to the exiles, the hurting, the lost, the suffering, the broken of Cape Coral, telling them about the grace, the peace, the love, the joy, and the life that God has for them. And Jeremiah only got to write this message in the full understanding firsthand of what it meant. I want you to look at this. Failure does not define you. God's love does that. And with that love comes purpose, a hope, and a future. Love and purpose, hope, and a future. The cliche is there's a purpose to your pain. Guys, my wife and I this coming November are celebrating 20 years of marriage. Thanks. Only by the grace of God. But let me tell you what that means. Let me tell you what that really means. The grace of God saving my marriage for 20 years. I just spent 20 minutes telling you that one. Guys, I felt called to ministry when I was 15. I spent a lot of time chasing after that, figuring out what that would look like, trying to make it happen. And finally, Pastor Brian mentioned, I got a job at Next Level. Yeah, I'd been at that church serving in the highest capacity I could because I didn't have a job in vocational ministry. So I was like, well, I'll get another job and just serve as high as I can. And then I finally got a job. I was the finance guy. I was the QuickBooks guy. Like, why? Because I tried to make that happen. I saw an opportunity and I basically forced my foot in the door. How could I be surprised 2 years later when they basically fired me? Not because I did anything wrong, but just because there wasn't anything else for me to do. What does that look like? Oh, I'm called to ministry. Just got fired from my only church job I've ever had. Not long after that, COVID hit and no one was going to church. Do we want to go back? I don't know. It's a good church. Doesn't feel like home. And that was how I got connected here. That's a whole other story. I'll tell you another time. I get to tell you in your situation right now that God has got you. You're going through something right now that God has got you. And not only that, there is hope and a future. There is love and purpose on the other side for it. Somebody else needs to know what you're going through and what God is doing for you. Guys, I get to tell you that because I've seen what he's done in my life, and I know he can do it for you. And if he can do it for you, and you can do that, then you get to tell the next guy, hey, God's got something for you. I know because he did it in my life. And so it goes on. That's how the gospel spreads. Not just shouting on the street corner about how much Jesus loves them. Tell them what Jesus did for you. That's the only thing that ever mattered. So before we go into discussion, just a couple of things I want to cover. If it's your first night, it's not always this intense. But there might be a reason why this is your first night. I want to reiterate something that we covered at the beginning. We do it at the start of every Tuesday night, and that's the ground rules. One of the most important ones is that what happens at the table stays at the tables. The discussion, this time where you guys get to relate to each other and share with each other, that's where this really gets real. That's where it got real for me. You see, I talked a little bit about how breaking that shame part of my cycle. The other part was isolation, and that broke. The best progress I've ever made on that was in the last few years when I sat at table 18, which is now table 21, with Dave and with Dan and with Nick and with Smitty and with Jeff Manus and Chris Stroka. Those guys know my story. They'll tell you. If any of this is BS, they'll tell you. Just ask them. That was where I managed to break the isolation, where I managed to start healing in some way. This, Cape Men, is a place of healing. I'm going to read this last part because I can't make it up any better than I wrote it out. A place of healing, of vulnerability, of grace, and community. We all have a story, times that Jerusalem was burning. For some of us, it's still burning right now. Some of us are dealing with addictions or failures in our marriages or our parenting or our work. We all have demons, our pasts, our fears. But praise Jesus, he has overcome. And beyond Jesus lifting us up and saving us, there's more. His love gives us purpose as well as salvation. And like Jeremiah, I'm here to tell you that's true because I have been and I still am living it. I got 3 discussion questions for you. They're relatively simple, but they're intended to be kind of hard-hitting. Table leaders, I want to remind you to trust your gut, the Holy Spirit, about how to manage the table, because this can be a heavy topic, and some of you have got 8 guys for 40 minutes. So trust the Spirit. And the last thing I want to say is, this is where it starts. This is where it starts. Start building that relationship. Start being able to be honest with each other. This is the start of the conversation. I love you guys. Thank you for giving me the privilege to even be here, much less up on stage. Thank you. I hope y'all are clapping for Jesus because it ain't me. So going into discussion time, Pastor Chris will be up. Pastor Chris, did I say that? I did. Wow. Wow. He will be up to close us out afterwards. And is Pastor Brian coming back up? Nope. All right. Jump in, guys.